When the wind turned, it came like a knife slipped between rings of mail. It lifted the parchment lamplight of dawn and drove snow against the old stones of Castle Black, whispering in the yard's corners as if to share a secret it had learned beyond the wall. Jon Snow stood bareheaded in that gray hour and watched his breath rise like smoke. Ghost's fur was white to the eye, but the wolf was a warmth pressed against Jon's thigh, a silent pulse of life that seemed at odds with the world's chill. Men in black drifted through the yard with the slow purpose of the freezing, and from above came a bell's reluctant note, muffled by snow. Jon looked up, and the sky was a low woolen ceiling, unstitched at the seams. A raven rose from the rookery in a clatter and vanished into that pocketed cloth. "Cold deepens," Melisandre said behind him, her voice soft. "The darker cold, not the one that bites the face. This is the cold that remembers." "I have enough of the sort that bites the face," Jon said, not turning. The Red Woman's presence snuffed out the subtle flavors of the morning and replaced them with smoke and spice. Even her silences seemed scented. "Your girl with the Karstark blood waits in the mess of your castle," she said. "She has wrapped herself in a man's resolve, but it will not be enough." "She is no girl," Jon said, though Alis was younger than he. "And she is her father's daughter." "And her father is ash in a drift," Melisandre answered. "Kings are seldom the only ones burned by their crowns." "Lady Alis is not a crown," Jon said. "Only a house, and Karhold is colder than any diadem." He turned at last. Her red eyes were like banked coals. "My lady, if you've come to offer me fire, I have 2,000 small mouths that will take it better than I." "The queen will want to speak to you," Melisandre said easily. "She will want to say you overstep. Perhaps. She is a woman who has learned to measure her wants by her anger." "Let her," Jon said, and smiled without meaning to. "Have you ever known me to step short?" She inclined her head, and he left her with her ashes and soft sneer of warmth, and crossed the yard. Snow squeaked under his boots. Above, a watchman coughed. The day smelled of smoke and wet iron, of lard and horse, and under it all the dry sweetness of cold. Inside the hall, the cold hesitated at the threshold and then followed him like an unwelcome hound. A handful of men bent over morning bread. Bowls steamed. The sound of wooden spoons scraping wood was as steady as prayer. Beneath the rafters, the banners of recent days hung heavy. The crowned stag of a king, the red heart in flames of a god Jon did not trust, the patched black of men who had no heraldry to themselves. And among them, on a bench near the fire where the logs hissed and bled sap, sat Alis Karstark with her hair bound in a loop of black ribbon. She rose when she saw him. Her face was built of angles as stark as old city walls, but there was something in her eyes that had not frozen. She had arrived wrapped in fear, and it had thawed into a hard, luminous determination that made Jon think of his father's look on mornings when the words had to be said, and there was no comfortable way to say them. "My lord," she began. "Jon," he corrected. "The Night's Watch has few lords." "Then Jon," Alis said, with a flash of that iron humor the Karstarks were said to possess. "I thank you for your bread and for the warmth of this fire. I have not slept well in days, but I have slept." She drew in a breath that made something in Jon's chest echo. "Cregan will come for me unless I am bound somewhere he dare not cut. Cregan will find your cousin's spear in his way," a taller young man said with a thick brow and the blunt, handsome face of a man hammered, not carved. Sigorn, Magnar of then, wore boiled leather and the pride of a land without trees. He had sat near Alis since last night's meal. He had not stopped watching the hall. Jon took them both in with a glance. "If you go back to Karhold with only a handful, he will take your hands. If you go with 50 people who don't belong there, he will say the wall has climbed down the wall." "We have climbed down," Tormund Giantsbane said cheerfully from another bench. Tormund had a half-eaten heel of bread in one hand and a laugh in the other. "Haven't you seen? Your yard is clogged with us. We piss where you piss and snore where you snore, and our lice sit counsel with your lice. It's a marvel of the age. It is also the cause of 100 quarrels," Bowen Marsh muttered near the hearth. He rose, stiff as a stake, and brought that narrow face to bear on Jon. "My lord Jon, we cannot keep acting as though the watch were a lord's hall. It is not for us to choose who holds Karhold or any other hold." "You're right," Jon said. "It is not. And yet," Bowen's voice honed itself on the edge of his patience, "and yet you gather us as though we were the mander, and your will is the tide." Jon felt Ghost's presence like a second shadow and steadied the part of himself that wanted to snarl. He had learned patience from a man who had walked as quiet as a thought. He had learned anger from all that man's ends. "We will not decide who holds Karhold. The gods will." "Convenient," Bowen said with a tight smile. "Convenient that the gods live in your wood." "They live," Tormund said with a grin that showed a missing tooth, "in any tree that will let them, and in no tree at all, if you ask me." Melisandre's soft laugh did not carry far. The Queen's men spoke in low murmurs like men adding up their accounts. Jon let the noise smooth itself into something like quiet. "Lady Alice," he said, "you are your father's blood, and your brother Harrion is a prisoner beyond our reach. The law of the North speaks of nearness and need. It says a hold belongs to the one who can hold it for the blood that built it. You came to the wall because your uncle means to marry you. Oh, his son, and steal what is not his by calling it your duty. He writes sweet words to a king and sharp ones to you. He weeps for Lord Rickard and lays snares in his stead." Alice lifted her chin. There was a tremor in one hand that she hid in the folds of her cloak. "Arnulf fears Stannis Baratheon," she said. "He thinks to please him with a show and betray him with a knife. He thinks the North is a table that can be set with whatever meat he likes." "The North is a house that remembers," Jon said, and every man in the hall seemed to look up as if a gust had lifted a banner. "Remembering does not feed a child," Bowen said dryly. "Nor does it fill a storehouse." "No," Jon agreed, "but sometimes remembering puts a lock on a door that should be locked." He inhaled, tasting ash and meat, and felt the day turning toward a choice that would be carved into more than wood. "Come to the God's Wood with me, all of you if you like, and if you don't like, come anyway." He walked out beneath Watchman's eyes, with Alice and Sigorn behind him, Tormund thumping along with the easy assurance of a man who believed the earth would catch him if he fell. Melisandre glided, and Bowen followed as if the path were an insult. The Queen's men trailed like smoke. Clydas, stooped and soft-eyed, came wobbling with a satchel of parchment and the look of a man who trusted ink to bring order to things that never had it. The God's Wood was smaller than Winterfell's and meaner, but the air in it had a weight that forest air gains when men ask it for promises. The heart tree's face was a shallow carving, mouth and eyes leaking sap like old tears. Snow lace lay in its branches. Jon felt the old blood stir that he had known kneeling at his father's side, the sense of a listening older than the language that named it. Alice sank to her knees and touched her forehead to the cold root. Sigorn looked at the tree as if it were a foe he could not defeat and bowed his head because his wife did. The Queen's men shifted, distasteful. Melisandre watched the white bark as if reading a secret in it and smiled at a passage no one else could see. Jon put his hand on the tree's trunk. He did not know if the wood felt it. It didn't matter. It was enough that he did. "We are asked to face south when we swore our vows," he said, and his voice carried in the stillness. "But the words were carved to face the north long before any of us were ever born. Lady Alice Karstark, daughter of Lord Rickard Karstark, with your brother Harrion beyond our reach and your house set upon by kin, do you place your hall under Winterfell until his return?" Alice's head snapped up. In her eyes he saw fear, and something else, like a lantern lit in a cave. "Winterfell?" she repeated, and the wind chose that moment to stir. The sound was nothing, only leaves touching leaves, yet men flinched as if a whisper had answered. "I do," she said, "by ice and bone and all that holds a roof fast in a storm. I place myself and mine under Winterfell until my brother returns or the line of Stark in the north fails." "It does not fail," Tormund muttered, but softly. It felt like a prayer in a man who had never learned to like prayers. Jon drew breath. He could feel Bowen Marsh's stare like a fingernail down the back of his neck. "Sigorn of then," he said, You are no man of those halls or any man's vassal. You came through our gate with a spear and a lot of madmen who would call this tree a stick and burn it to stay warm. Will you take this lady to wife and by that tie hold what is hers to hold? Not for Southron crowns or queens that sell their prayers, but for Winterfell and the old laws that make a house a house. Sigorn's gaze slid to Alice and then back. He knelt with the awkward grace of a man accustomed to slopes underfoot. I will, he said, and his voice was the slow pulse of stones in a river. I will hold her hold for her and for this place you call Winterfell. I'll put my spear at its gate if need be and my back to its wall if it breaks. Melisandre's lips curled. The old gods have no crowns, she murmured. How lucky for the boy whose crown was stolen by a bed of snow. Jon ignored her. He raised his eyes to the heart tree's face. Then hear us, he said. He felt the words lift the chill from his lungs and carry it into that silent mouth. Let it be carved, if not in wood, then in the days to come. Karhold is bound to Winterfell, winter to winter, until the rightful heir returns. Let it be known that Lady Alice and Sigorn, Magnar of then, hold there for the blood that built the hall, not for any who came later and draped it in deception. The wind fell into stillness as if a door had shut. Snow landed on Sigorn's shoulder and did not melt. Alice's breath made small clouds. Bowen Marsh's eyebrows climbed into the shelter of his hood. He opened his mouth and shut it. Clyda's shuffled forward with parchment. Jon took it. The words were his, stamped by a seal that had once been Ned Stark's and now was a piece of wax with a long shadow. He pressed it to the wet trunk, then lifted it and pressed it again to the back of his glove, leaving the smear of sap like blood on the leaf. He thought of the way words grew heavier when enough people believed them. He thought of his father saying that power was a shadow on a wall, and sometimes shadows weighed as much as iron. When it was done, the small crowd dissolved into voices. The Queen's men withdrew to mutter and count grievances. Melisandre drifted up beside Jon. You have given a bride to a stone, she said, and named it a king. I have named what it always was, Jon said, before crowns were hammered, before books were bound. And your black brothers? She asked, a tilt of her head like a touch. What are they in this feast you set out? Guests? Or the meat? Guests, Jon said. Always guests. And guests who are not fed grow wroth. Then I will feed them, he said simply. He left her then and went out into the yard again, and the cold took his breath the way a friend bumps his shoulder and laughs. Snow had thickened. He imagined Karhold caught in this same whitening of the world. Tall walls scribed with white lines, the river freezing slow as old age, the great timbers of the hall groaning as ice set in the grain. He had never been to Karhold, only heard his father's voice say its name, and the sound had been all angles. The ravens went out that midday. To the last hearth, to White Harbor, to Bear Island, to the Bar Rolands and the lonely towers along the Bay of Seals. Clyda's gnarled fingers wrapped twine around tubes and his eyes watered as he whispered each destination to the bird, as if words were a wind he could aim. Bowen Marsh penned a careful descent and ended with a line that might have been a threat or an appeal. Jon read it and signed his name beneath, received. He didn't answer it. He had already answered. Stagwives will have to tantrum, Tormund said as he paced the yard with Jon late in the day. Bareheaded as always, beard glistening with frost like a net of stars. Queens, you call them. They taste like any woman, I'd wager. I once had a woman who... Stop there, Jon suggested. All right, Tormund said cheerfully. I'll save the tale for the feast when this is behind us. If there's a feast, I'll bring meat if you bring ale, and you bring ale if I bring meat, and if neither of us brings either, we can chew on our own tongues. A fine meal, tongues. Your humor is like your beard, Jon said, a glint pricking at the corner of his mouth. It wanders. And yours is like your hair, sulks. Tormund threw an arm around Jon's shoulders for an instant and then dropped it. You named Karhold bound to Winterfell. To what Winterfell? The burned one, the empty one? The little she-bear swears to it like a prayer. I know, Jon said. He had the letter from Bear Island. The bear's paw was stamped in green wax, And inside the script declared what it had always declared, what his blood remembered even as his cloak forgot. Houses need something to bind to. Bind them to yourself, Tormund said. You're as much a wolf as I've seen, boy. I am the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Jon said. And, Tormund said, with a clap so hard it nearly knocked Jon down. A boy who won't say his name to a fire for fear it will spit it back as a curse. You'll die of pride before you die of cold. We all die of something, Jon said, and the words came out flat. He thought of Robb on a floor with blood painting the wolf's head on the banners around him. He thought of his father's quiet lion-faced executioner and the way the air had carried the smell of oil that day in King's Landing. He thought of a girl with brown eyes pretending to be a girl with gray. He shook those thoughts off like snow. By nightfall, the Queen sent for him. The chamber she had taken held a lingering false warmth from braziers. In their glow, her face had the smoothness of wax and the stillness too. Shireen sat with a wooden knight and a wooden dragon arrayed on the table between them, and her small mouth pursed in thought as if the outcome would decide more than a game. You presume, Queen Celis said without preface. I did what needed doing, Jon said. Your Grace. What needed doing? She repeated, as if the phrase were an object she was weighing. My duty does not permit me to humor the superstitions of half-wild northerners. I tolerate them for the sake of my king's purpose. And now I am told that in your gods would you have made a pact that binds a great fortress to a ruin and calls it law. Under whose authority, Lord Commander? Under the old laws of the North, your Grace, Jon answered. Under the eyes of the old gods. The old gods, she said, her mouth tightening. We are not in a tale told around a peat fire. I should have you remind your men that their vows forbade this. You are not a Stark lord. You are a crow. Do you know why they call men of the Watch crows? Because they are scavengers. Because they gather what the storm has left and pick it down to brittle. Shireen looked up, startled. Mama, she said, crows are clever. Not this one, the Queen said, without moving her gaze from Jon. You will undo the thing. You will write a letter saying you overstepped and the woman is to be returned. Her uncle will see justice is done. The king will consider the matter. If I write that letter, Jon said, I write a death writ for a girl who ran to my gate from men who would use her to steal. I write Karhold into the hands of a traitor who smiles for you and sharpens his blade for your throat. And I write the North further from you in a winter that will strip it to bone. Melisandre, a shadow against the stone, smiled. He speaks like a story, she said. I almost believe him. I find I do, Shireen whispered. Celis shot her a glance so swift and sharp it seemed to whistle in the air. The girl bent back to her pieces, cheeks pink. Celis smoothed her gown with flat hands. You court ruin, she said. Do as you will. When my lord returns and you have made trouble out of thin air, he will hang it around your neck. When your king returns, Jon said, let him hang me for keeping a pledge any man who ever warmed his hands at a northern hearth would keep. The Watch keeps ancient oaths. I am but keeping one more. He left her then. What else was there to say? And slept badly and woke before dawn to a sky that promised a day of stubborn snow. The letters winged south. The sun trudged its short path and fell out of sight. Men quarreled in corners and laughed loudly over weak ale. The world went on. The next day, a raven came back with a broken shaft lodged between its wing bones. Another came with its head half gnawed by something and the scroll ruined. The third came whole, with a cracking of wings and a flurry of ice. It hopped angrily along the table until Clydas took the tube from its leg and ortaed the ribbon with trembling fingers. White Harbor, he said, and pushed the letter to Jon. The script was neat as threads on a noblewoman's sleeve. It said that Lord Wyman had heard. It said he took no positions until the snows melted and the sea froze. It said that those who called themselves the North should behave like men who remembered they were cousins and not wolves who'd lost the scent. It was as much as Jon could expect. Bear Island's answer came the day after, short as a spear thrust. The she-bear wrote in her own sharp hand that Winterfell was the North and houses that forgot it would find their own fires cold. She told Jon what food they could spare and where to fetch it, and warned that any man wearing Bolton's flayed man would eat what he stole and die of it besides. Jon's breath ghosted between his teeth. He thought of a hall full of mended banners at Winterfell, of the pools black as ink beneath the heart tree there, of stone that had known the weight of so many feet that it hummed with it. On the third day, the watch brought a woman's shoe, narrow, lined with rabbit's fur, torn at the strap and frozen into a shape like a question. It had been found among the barrels near the lower gate. "Your new folk," Bowen Marsh said. "They multiply in every dark. They bring their feuds. They call us brother and they take our bread, and I do not trust their eyes." "They go where they're told," Jon said. "And when we call, they answer." "Do they?" Bowen asked. He lifted the shoe and let it fall. "Do they answer to you, Lord Commander, or to the wind that promised them meat?" Jon said nothing. Bowen's face had changed these past months. It had become gaunter, as if ill thoughts ate a man from behind the skin. He had sat at Jon's council table as a boy sits at the edge of a frozen pond. Only his boots touched the ice, but he felt the cold creeping through leather. That afternoon, as the light thinned, the wedding was done. Alice wore a simple gown that had been white once and was now winter's white, sewed through with gray at the hem. When she smiled, the room seemed to tilt. Sigorn had scrubbed his hair until it lay obediently and had his beard trimmed to something like a knight's. He looked uncomfortable and proud. Tormund wept into his cup and said the last woman he had wed had a bear's temper and a beard longer than any of the men assembled, and there was no use denying him a story the room needed. The Queen's men stood in a hard knot, arms crossed, offended that the vows were spoken in a hall where heart trees had once been carved into chair arms and were now covered with flags. When the words were done, Alice and Sigorn drank from a horn and kissed with shy competence. And there was bread and there was salt. That night the snow lifted slightly, as if even the sky had come near to watch. Before dawn they went. It had to be quick and quiet. They wore furs pulled low and carried a handful of small, hard things. Sharpened iron, string, a flint, pins, the sort of things that can change the day when placed in the right place at the right hour. A score of thens went with them under Sigorn's whisper, and 2 men of the watch who had never learned to doubt Jon when he asked for something that sounded like trouble. Jon watched them slip through the gate and felt the old fear coil and uncoil in his belly. The fear a man feels when he sends something precious toward a cliff in the fog and cannot see the path. He had done what had to be done. The rest he could not do. "Bold," said Melisandre behind him, as if commenting on a cut of cloth. "You give a spear to a hand that loves you and ask it to fight for a house that may never see you as its master." "It is not my mastership that matters," Jon said, again without looking. The snow drifted across the stones like slow smoke. "It is order. It is the promise that one thing is bound to another." "You fear chaos," Melisandre said. "Chaos makes strong men kings." "My brother was a strong man," Jon said. "He died in a hall where men had eaten his bread. Chaos makes flayed men kings too." She smiled and went away. The days that followed were full of small work and larger silence. Jon kept his counsel and watched the yard and listened to the way words changed among the men. The wildlings were careful, or careful as wildlings ever are. They made themselves smaller in corners. They kept their laughter lower and their fires higher. The Black Brothers walked the edges of those fires like men walking cliff paths. One the giant slept in the old builder's lodge and snored like thunder. Ghost ranged and returned, snow on his muzzle. Jon wrote to White Harbor again and to the Isle of Skagos on a wild thought and to Last Hearth with careful words that shook with weight he could not write down. On the 5th day a raven came from Karhold, and it came in at a slant as if the air itself were tilted. The tube on its leg was dark with frozen blood. Clydas cracked it open with his thumb and made a sound that was not a word, only an old man's gasp. "What is it?" Jon asked. Clydas's lips moved, forming a name. He handed the parchment to Jon with fingers that shook. Lady Alice wrote in a hand less sure than her tongue. She wrote that the lower gate had opened to her name more easily than she had dared hope. She had spoken the names of house servants who had wiped her hands when she was a child and called that familiarity to her cause. She had walked past spearmen who blinked at the sight of her and did not lower their points. She had stood in the great hall with its high rafters and hearths the size of boats turned on their sides, and called by name the steward who had held her once to see if she would laugh. He had laughed first, and after that it seemed that things cannot help but change. Cregan had come with a small iron coin in his palm, and he had flipped it, and when it came down and did not say what he wanted, it was as if the gods had spoken. To him, in a language he needed, he yielded. He yielded, Alice wrote, with a look she would not trust in a hungry dog, let alone in a man. Arnulf was not at Karhold. He had gone to treat with men in white furs, she wrote, and there the letter blurred where a drop had fallen and the ink had bled. She wrote that Sigorn had sworn before the weirwood in Karhold's small god's wood, a pale knot of roots in a cleft between walls, and that her folk had cheered and the thens had grunted in their fashion, which was cheering if you squinted at it. She wrote that their stores were thinner than she had feared and less than a month from making pale bread. She wrote that they had found 3 girls hidden in the kennels and 2 in the buttery and a boy behind the ale barrels, and that she had kissed each of their cheeks and told them winter had not yet taken the whole world. She wrote that the sun had shown its rim that morning for the first time in days and had looked like the Karstark sun blackened at the edges. She wrote that she would hold Karhold for Winterfell until Harrion came, and if he never came, then until her own hair turned white. She wrote that she had sent men to Last Hearth to bargain for grain and had sent riders to speak to the Umbers, careful in the words, clever in the pauses. She wrote that she had a girl in her hall who had been told to be someone else and had almost succeeded, and she asked Jon what to do with a miracle that had been carved into a lie. Jon read it twice, then a third time. The words crawled down his spine and warmed his middle the way a strong drink might. He thought of a winter morning in Winterfell, his father's hand briefly heavy on his hair, the words of the Stark motto said as if they were nothing and everything. He looked up at Bowen and then away. He could not help smiling, small and helpless as a boy's. He was careful to let no one see. He sent for Val, the woman the queen called a princess and the free folk called herself. She came with snow and the clink of beads at her braid. He handed her the letter. She read it and raised one eyebrow. "So," she said, "your little wolf has made herself a den." "It seems so," Jon said. "There is a girl with her, the one Ramsay Bolton calls his wife. She is not Arya. She is one we both knew." "I knew one who smelled of sadness," Val said and shrugged. "If she is a bird finding that her feathers were painted, not grown, she will be tender." "What will you do, Lord Snow?" "Feed Karhold," Jon said, "and make men understand what they have sworn. The North is not a word written on a map. It is the oath men say to themselves when they are alone and no one is listening." Val looked softly. "Careful," she said. "You speak as if you wore a crown in your blood." "I do not," Jon said. She tilted her head. "That is the only kind that holds," she said and went. The days were busy afterward. He sent Tormund with 100 to the crofters' villages of the Gift to collect the tithes owed to men who now needed them. He sent a quiet word to Wyman Manderley through the Merman's court about exchanging iron for flour at terms that were a mercy hidden in a bargain. He sent a man he trusted to Last Hearth who had once crossed the Frostfangs with a broken foot and lived. He did the sort of work no man sings about, and because he did it the singing might one day be true. The trouble came, as trouble always does, with a letter. The raven that bore it did not fly right. His right wing drooped, and its beak was chipped. It fought the air like a man fights a current. When it struck the sill it slid in snow and thrashed, and Clydas caught it up like a child taken in midfall and soothed it with sound. He took the tube from its leg with hands gentler than a maester's and peered at the seal as if each line could wound him. Could. The wax was pink, and the impression in it was made by something sharp enough to carve flesh. Jon read the words and felt the room tilt. He heard the sounds of the yard grow small and far away. Around him, sound was muffled by the blood in his ears. The letter named him bastard, and it named him oathbreaker. It listed the things taken from the man who sent it and demanded them back, as if men were chickens and love was a cloak one could return for another size. It claimed a victory in the snow for the flayed man and told of banners burned and kinsmen hung, and a king's sword snapped above a knee. It spoke of a girl taken from a bed and a giant who had roared and of skins cured. It ended with a promise to come north if what was demanded was not sent south. He read it twice, then once more. He folded it carefully and set it on the table as if it might burn through the wood. He kept his hands from shaking by force. He gathered men in the shield hall. The hall had known feasts in the days when the wall had been more than a lost argument. Now it knew men in armor that had been mended so often it remembered the smith's fingers better than the steel. The wind fought to come in through the shuttered windows, and men's breath climbed like a gray canopy toward the rafters. Jon stood and told them what the letter said. He did not shout. He did not call for blood. He said a girl was in danger. He said a man had written that he would come with knives and fire. He said that there was a house in the north that had sworn itself to Winterfell, and that oath meant more than any whim of a cruel boy in a stolen hall. "You would have us march," Bowen Marsh said. He was very pale. "I would have me march," Jon said. "I know what my vows say, Bowen. And you test them at every corner." Bowen returned, his voice brittle. "You sit among kings and queens. You promise holds to houses. You give our enemies a hall to sit in and call it a wedding. You want now to ride south with wildlings for a girl who is not your sister and a house that will never be yours. And what then? You will return, and what will be left? The watch will be broken lee. Cuan old or." Jon let the words set. "The watch will be what we make it," he said. "You think the watch is a hall and a set of words and the color we wear. But it is a choice, Bowen. It is always a choice. I will not lead any man where his oath will break. I will ride as Jon Snow. I will ask who will come with me as men, not brothers. The brothers will stay." The room murmured. Tormund barked a laugh. "You make a ladder of the things in your way," he said. "I like it. I will go," said Leathers, the wildling who had sworn the black with a grin. Others nodded. Some of the black brothers looked away. "I forb," Bowen began, and then he swallowed the word as if it burned. "You cannot forbid me to be a man," Jon said quietly. "Only to be your Lord Commander. And if that is what it takes to make the line stand somewhere, then it will be that." Melisandre sat in the shadow of a pillar, her red eyes slanted like a cat's. Jon could not tell whether she smiled. He left the hall with the sound of voices slipping after him like fish. The yard bit his face and the wind threw handfuls of snow into his, and he breathed in relief. In the open air, he could hear his thoughts again. He headed for the armory. Ghost slid through the snow beside him, the low, soundless joy of the hunting wolf in every stride. They were nearly at the steps when the first blow came. It was not steel. It was a word in a hiss, and then a boot scuff, and a shadow that had waited too long to strike and so had chosen now, when everyone's eyes were turned to the thing he had said and not to the man he had always been. "For the watch," a voice said behind him. Ghost snarled toward the air, a ragged banner in a storm. Jon turned too late for the first knife. It slid between the rings at his sleeve's edge, under the plate he had strapped with fingers that morning, and found his bicep. He grunted and stepped back, and the man who had stabbed him found Ghost's teeth closing on his forearm with an awful, wet sound. The man screamed. One rose from his corner like a mountain coming awake and swatted a second assailant into the snow with a sound like a man hitting an oak with a club and the club breaking. The snow took him. "Stop!" Jon shouted. He did not know who he meant. The yard erupted. Men ran. Someone cried, "Hold!" The Queen's men spilled from a door like anger escaping a bottle. Tormund bellowed. Steel shone and vanished in the snow. Bowen Marsh stood a few feet away with a knife in his hand and horror in his face like paint. He lifted the blade as if to throw it away and then gripped it harder as if the steel no longer belonged to him and would run otherwise. "Bowen," Jon said. He lifted his left hand, palm open. He felt blood sliding down his arm, hot and insistent. It soaked his glove and made a fan of red in falling snow. "Bowen, look at me." Bowen's mouth worked. "You are burning us," he said, and tears slid down the grooves beside his nose. "I have followed you and you do not know the road. You do not know the road and you take us into the snow." "I am on the same road," Jon said. It has only turned, and we have to turn with it. Bowen moved. The knife glinted. Ghost loomed. Alice Karstark's oath rose in Jon's mind. I place myself under Winterfell, winter to winter. He saw in some interior place a hall with a ceiling like the undersides of boats and a girl with black ribbon in her hair. He saw a heart tree with its sap-bled face. He saw his father's hands. The knife went nowhere. Bowen stopped as if a rope had been put around his chest. Sigorn had him by the wrist, his grip a ring of iron. Jon hadn't seen the then until he was there, moving like a man who knew where the stones lay under the snow. Behind him, Alice Karstark stood with a hand on the hilt of a short sword she could barely lift. Her hair had escaped its ribbon and whipped across her cheek. Her eyes were fever bright. "We swore," Alice said into the yard's gathered shock. Her voice carried better than her father's had. "To Winterfell and to the man who remembers it. He is the one who put my roof back over my head. He is the one whose letters turned men's hands from my throat. He did not ask me for my harvest or my bed. He asked me for my oath, and I gave it. If you cut him, you cut what I gave, and you do not know the price." Bowen's eyes shuddered toward her. "This is not your hall," he said hoarse. Alice stepped forward, slipping on the snow and catching herself with a curse that made Tormund bark a sharp, delighted sound. "It is," she said. "All of the north is a hall when the storm comes on you. The watch took me in when I was hunted. The watch gave me bread. It is not a castle. It is a fire that men stand around. And there is a man whose face the light lands on. Let him be what he is." Ghost released the man he had mangled. Blood steamed in the snow. One was breathing hard, hot breath pluming. Men who had drawn steel without understanding why looked down and saw what their hands had done and wished them empty again. Queen's men hovered as if waiting to see whose side was brighter. Bowen's knife weakened. It dropped and struck the snow with a soft sound. He bowed his head. "I love the watch," he whispered. "I loved it when it was smaller than this and colder and we ate oatcake and called it roast. I love it for all it has been, and I do not know it anymore." Jon's voice was gentle. "I do not know it either, Bowen. It doesn't know itself. But it will." He took a step and his leg almost folded. The yard spun and steadied. The cut in his arm throbbed like a drum. "Val," he said, "take this man to a cell that is warm and lock it out of kindness. Leathers, fetch Othel. We will sort this. We will sort all of it." The day crept into evening with the unsteady gait of a man walking after a fight. Men were sent to mend. The dead were laid on boards. Clydas came with a jar and a strip of linen and a frown that had seen too many boys bleed. "Al." Wyatt stood near Jon while he sat on a bench in the armory, head tilted, eyes half-lidded, while the needle went in and out and pulled his skin together. She smelled faintly of horse and smoke. "You should be at Karhold," he said without looking at her. He had not asked how she had arrived so swiftly, but he could guess. Karhold was not so far as Winterfell, and the outrunners could eat up the leagues. "You should be holding your hall." "My hall can stand one day without me," she said. "This hall would not." "You were near," he said, and there was a question in it. "We were," she said. "The Rodehart. We brought flour, what little we could spare. We brought 5 men and 3 boys with hands for mending things. We brought a piper. Karhold's walls hum when someone whistles. I missed the noise." He smiled at that and winced when the needle bit. "The letter I received," he said, "from the Dreadfort." "Winterfell," she corrected with acid sweetness. "They hold it and call it theirs, but it is not. Words do not change truth. They discovered that years ago and have been angry ever since." "He wants the girl," Jon said. "He names a price in blood. He writes as if he can command the sky." He felt a tiredness that had nothing to do with the cut and everything to do with words. "I will go to Winterfell and take her out." "You are a man who has more ways to die than most," Alice said calmly. "Pick the one that buys the most for those who'll live." "There is no one else to send," Jon said. Alice was quiet a time. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "There is. There are houses that have spent their anger on their bread. There are men who owe their lives to the free folk and do not want to admit it. There are boys who have never left their holdfasts and will call themselves men if someone gives them a good reason. There is Karhold. There is the woman who governs the last hearth when her lord is drunk. There is the fat lord who loves his city like a child and loves the north like a song he can't get rid of. There is a girl your father raised who bites like the wind and cuts like thin ice. And if she lives, she is the north. Jon swallowed, startled by the sudden fierce pressure behind his eyes. I feel, he said, as if each person I ask to move is a stone I risk dropping on my own foot. Then, Alice said, wear boots. That night, a fire crowded the hall, and the shadows climbed the walls with long legs. Men ate, some of them with their left hands because their right ones were wrapped tight. The giant ate whole loaves as if they were apples. Tormund told a story that failed to end 6 times and then ended when he forgot where it began. The queen's men ate with their mouths in straight, thin lines and left early to bend their thoughts into shape elsewhere. Jon rose and said that arranging would ride south. He said this as if it were nothing to do with oaths and everything to do with snow. He chose the men who would go and the men who would stay. Tormund would go. Leathers would go. 100 wildlings would go, because they had hearts that ran hot when a hunt was promised. 5 black brothers asked to go and he refused all but one. Iron Emmett, because he knew the man did not question and would watch his back without thinking about what it meant. Melisandre stayed and watched him move his pieces as if seeing a pattern he had not yet understood. Do you guess the shape? She asked softly as he passed her. I see a shape, he said. I don't know if it's the right one. Shapes are all the world is, she said, and her smile looked tired. Fire makes shapes of smoke. Cold makes shapes of water. We call them omen and law and pretend they will stay. They never do. Then we are foolish, he said. Yes, she said, as if it were a blessing. They rode at first light 2 days later, under a sky so white it felt like walking under canvas. The cold did not relent, but it did not sharpen. It held as a debt holds. The men moved like men who knew their work. The free folk flowed around the black brothers like a stream around stones. Jon rode at the fore with Tormund half a length behind, and Ghost was a moving absence beside him that made horses startle if they saw him at the wrong moment. They angled southeast, past the villages they had filled with people who would never have seen such walls if Jon had not let them in. Women watched with suspicion that would thaw when their children did not die. Men watched with the hollowed eyes of winter and the defiance of someone whose world had tasted meat again for the first time in a season. The land lay under snow like a sleeping beast. They saw no one wearing the flayed man until the 3rd day. They were 6, not 20, and they were foraging badly, which meant they were desperate. Jon's men surrounded them, and there was a brief, awful noise of men whose plans have slipped through their fingers like wet rope. Jon watched one drop his spear and hold his hands up and say he had been at the Manor once and had slept in the shade of the high tower and had never liked the taste of the north. Jon believed him because it did not matter. Tormund wanted to give them to the giant to pick his teeth with. Jon sent them blindfolded to the small village occupied by the free folk and told the women which men to trust and which to send further on. He took from the captives nothing but the words he could use, which were few and brittle. They came on Winterfell at dusk on the 5th day. It rose out of the land as if it had grown there, except the soil was wrong and the air smelled like the ghosts of fires. The broken outer walls stood like teeth snapped and not set, and the banners at the gate were clean as a lie. Jon sat his horse and felt the old ache in his chest, the one that returned whenever he saw the place where his life had taken its true shape. Tormund glanced at him and then away. "Die it with courtesy." "We cannot storm it," Jon said. "We can tear it. We can take a bite and spit," Tormund agreed. "More trouble in a dog that snaps than in a dog that chews. What do you want, boy?" "I want," Jon said, and then stopped. He wanted to walk into the godswood and kneel where the roots grew old and put his hand on wood and ask for names to be given back. He wanted to burn the pink letter. He wanted to spill Ramsay Bolton out onto the snow and see the man's breath leave him and not come back. He wanted his sister and he wanted his father, and none of that could be had. "I want the girl," he said instead. And I want to place fear in men who have none, and I want to remind other men that the wolf's eyes are not blind. They did what could be done. Iron Emmett took 5 to cut their way into the old mill and set a fire in the straw. Leathers and 2 then slid under the old Sally gate and cut the throat of the guard who shouldn't have been yawning. Tormund walked up to the front gate and laughed loud. And when a man looked down, he shot him through the eye with an arrow he had no right to make land. Somewhere, in some half-remembered corner of the castle, a servant girl or a boy who carried wood began to cry. The snow began again. They found the girl with the false name in the kennels, because of course she had gone there. The dogs knew her smell and had not barked long, and the man with her had been given chances to be brave and had not taken them, and then there had been no choices left at all. She was shaking when they cut her free. She was brave and then not brave and then brave again. Jon wrapped her in a cloak that was almost his and led her into the dark. Men shouted on the walls. Somewhere a horn blew. In the yard, men ran like ants spilled from a split log. Jon walked into the white and felt his heart settle into its right place, as if the ribs had not known exactly where to hold it until now. The flight out was a play that returned to its costume chest every trick they had used on the way in. They disappeared into the snow's open mouth and were gone before the gate could open wide enough for horses to pour through. Steel glinted behind them and then went out. The girl cried once like a child and then swallowed it like a grown woman and clung. They turned not north but east, and then they curved around, and then north again by a path that had very little to recommend it beyond the fact that no one would think to take it. They lost a horse in a stream that had not shown itself until the wrong hoof found it, and nearly lost a man to a fall. One wept loudly when he realized they were not turning to fight more, and Tormund slapped the giant's leg and told him to hush before he knocked down the moon. The snow deepened. The cold turned thoughtful and decided to be kind. It was still a bastard, only a less inventive one. They made for Karhold because Alice had sent men with torches out beyond the lower gate every night, and those torches were birds in the dark to men who had been too long in it. They arrived with the dawn and went in on legs that had forgotten what not moving was. The hall smelled of smoke and turnip and leather and something that might have been hope if a man had been foolish enough to name it. Alice stood at the top of the steps and looked at the girl and looked at Jon and did not ask her name. "Welcome," she said. "You are who you are, and if you wish to be someone else still, we can have that talk by the fire." The girl cried then, because that is what kindness does to the brave. Jon stood and felt nothing for a heartbeat and then felt everything all at once. He had not realized how tight his chest had been until the air went in and out without the hook attached. They laid their plans there for the day that was already planning them. Weary men slept in corners. Wolves, Karhold had a few, kept lean, slept too, in a manner of speaking, twitching in their dreams. Jon leaned over a map that had seen many hands. Alice explained where the line of river ice would break first and where the Bolton's riders always went when they had gone too far. The Magner traced a line along the ridge and announced where he would set his lean men with their close, cruel spears. One wanted to sleep. Everyone wanted to sleep. No one did. Messages went out from Karhold with honest seals, not desperate ones. They went to Last Hearth and White Harbor and Deepwood Motte, to 2 towers no one remembered except the old women in the kitchens, to a village that had always had a wooden watchtower because there had been giants once and someone had wanted to see farther than he could shout. They went to Skagos with words that admitted fear and offered bread. They went to the wall, and one went to the crofters' village near the lake where Stannis Baratheon waited with a stubbornness that would either be called courage or folly when men told this part later. The words spread in thin lines like cracks in ice, and when enough cracks meet, something larger breaks. Jon did not stay. He took 2 hours' sleep and then rose with hands that shook and eyes that burned and rode back toward the wall. He left the girl at Karhold because Alice could wrap her in a house and he could only wrap her in a cloak. He left Thens because they had learned to like Karhold's walls as a man learns to like the shape of a sword handle. He left Tormund because someone had to tell the story in the hall and make men think it had all been easy, or at least funny. He left part of himself, some piece that had loosened and fallen off this last winter, and it made him lighter for the ride. The wall rose ahead of him like a promise and a threat. He crested the last hill and saw the watchtowers like teeth against the gray, and felt the little stir of home that no one had ever promised him, and that he had never been asked to pay for, and that he paid for daily anyway. Ghost loped ahead. Jon's breath smoked, and he counted the turns to the gate the way a boy counts the steps to a lover's door. Back at Castle Black, the world took his shape again and then tilted. Bowen Marsh sat in a cell that had a blanket and a bench and food that would not freeze. He looked up when Jon entered and looked down again quickly, not out of shame but as if the light hurt his eyes. Jon set a cup of mulled ale on the table and waited for the steam to reach Bowen's nostrils. "I want to hang you," Jon said in a conversational way. "I want to hang you in the yard where every man can see what it looks like when a man who loves something will kill it to keep anyone else from touching it." He shrugged. "But I won't." Bowen's mouth twisted. "You talk like a lord." "I am a bastard and a crow," Jon said. "I have to talk better, because the words are all I have that is dry." "Then why?" Bowen asked, eyes lifting now and cutting red. "Do I feel like you are winning something while I lose everything?" "Because the world doesn't match the picture you saved in your head," Jon said. "Mine either. You wanted a watch without kings. You wanted one without girls, without giants, without people who laughed too loud. You wanted the old oats and the old routine and the old small pride. That world froze. We stand around the fire we have. If you cannot bear it, I will give you a horse and a day and a full skin, and you can go to a hall that will eat you. Or you can stay here and help me make this place something that works." "I tried to kill you," Bowen said very softly. "I noticed," Jon said. "So did Ghost." Bowen closed his eyes. "I would have missed," he lied. And Jon smiled, because a lie is sometimes the last gift a man can offer himself. He left Bowen there. He left him his shame and his cup. He went to the yard and stood and watched men drill with wooden swords and a woman teach a boy to set a trap. He watched his shadow move a pace with the winter sun and felt the ache of a cut knitting itself around the thread. He thought of the words he had set into the heart of the Karhold's weirwood, and how words are only words until the day the whole world agrees they are the bones of something that stands. The winter went on. It wrote itself across the north with a cold finger. Men died of small things and big ones. A raven brought a word from White Harbor that sounded like merriment from a house that had remembered an old song. Another brought a word from Deepwood that smelled of pine and blood. Another brought a word from the sisters on their spears of sand and seaweed. And Jon smiled at that, because it mattered that even on that narrow rim of the world someone was paying attention. Karhold held. The girl with the fake name learned to sit quietly sometimes and to shout at others. She learned that a dog will love you for being kind and also for dropping food, and that these are two different loves and both worth having. She learned that the word lady can be a collar or a cloak. She learned that you can be one person inside and another outside, and that this does not make the inside less true. Alice taught her to hold a knife and to drop it at exactly the right moment to make someone think she had lost it. Sigourney taught her to look men straight in the eye when they tried to look at anything but her face. She taught them that you do not have to be what someone else called you. One came once in spring that was not a spring and sat outside Karhold's gate and hummed. Jon wrote and rode and ate and slept poorly. He laughed sometimes, and it startled him and made the men near him look up, and then they laughed too, not because the thing he had said was funny, but because he had laughed and there had been not enough laughter. He spoke to Melisandre and did not believe her. He spoke to the queen and tried to believe her and could not. He spoke to the boys and girls of the watch, the old ones and the new ones, and said things that sounded like sense even when they weren't. When he closed his eyes at night in whatever bed he had, he saw Karhold's small godswood and a girl's hand on rough bark. He saw Winterfell in snow and smoke and in green and light. He saw an old man's steady hand on a boy's head and, when he turned, the space that old hand had left. In time, the oath he had taken and the oath he had made others take braided together. Men would speak his name and speak Winterfell's in the same breath and not stop to think whether one belonged with the other. He did not smile at that, and he did not frown. He had no time for either. He found himself on a wall made of ice with a world on both sides of it, and thought not for the first time that he was better at mending what had cracked than building new. The letters stopped naming him bastard as often. They started asking if he was sure. He was never sure. He made decisions as a man chops wood, clean strokes, and not too much time thinking about the wood that will never burn. He listened to those who did not agree with him, because he had learned the cost of not listening. He forgave men who would not have forgiven him and punished men who would have forgiven him too much. He ate every loaf of bread that had been made by hands he had never seen, as if it were a sacrament of trust. When spring came, if one could call it spring, and in the north one learned it was better to call it not winter and leave it at that, the snow retreated enough for roads to be mud instead. Jories and Paxes and Toms rode into Karhold and out of it, and the gatekeepers learned the names of horses. Men came with excuses and left with obligations. The wolves in Karhold's kennels grew fat and then sleek and then dangerous and then loyal. The thens learned to fix roofs and ask for nails and to complain about the way Karstark men salted meat. The Karstark men learned that a spear that had felt the fist of the wind in a place with no trees will stand steady in a gale. The banners on Karhold's walls faded and were sewn anew. The big black sun with its long rays did not change because such NGS do not change. And men spoke in kitchens by firelight about the day a girl in black ribbon had stood in a courtyard with snow in her hair and told men in black that their hall was bigger than they thought. They spoke about how the Lord Commander had put his hand on a tree and made the people in a hold that had always thought itself a loner say a word out loud they had always said only to themselves. They spoke of how words can be a house when men are hungry for shelter. Some said he had exceeded his right. Some said he had found it. Once, in the middle of such a night, Jon woke with the sense that someone had taken his name and turned it over in their fingers as if to see how it was made. He got up and stood at the window and watched the sky bleed slowly from dark to less dark. Ghost came and leaned against him and did not make a sound. Jon rested a hand on the wolf's head and thought of boys in the yard at Winterfell, and the sound of ice breaking on the river in thaw, and the tang in the air when snow has given up for a day. He thought of Alice Karstark, all angles and decision, and of the boy who had stood in front of him with a knife and tears in his eyes and the certainty that he was saving something that would otherwise be lost. The wall held. The North did what it always does in hard times. It remembered, not perfectly, not without cost, not with the insistent smoothness of a tale told at the end of a good meal. But men looked at the hills and said the word Winterfell, and the hills did not argue. They said Karhold. And somewhere a woman with a short sword she could barely lift stood straighter without knowing why. Jon rode again and again under skies of iron and pewter. He grew lines about his eyes that did not go away in summer's light. He made peace with the part of himself that would always be a boy in a yard looking up at a wall and wondering which side was his. He never decided, and that was all right. He did not need to. Once, a letter came with a seal he had not seen in long months. A direwolf on gray. The hand that wrote it was young but had learned too much too quickly. It did not say the thing anyone had wanted it to say. It said something else. That a house could be many things at once and still be itself. That brothers do not always call each other brother but are thus anyway. That the North could bind itself in ways that had nothing to do with banners and everything to do with bread shared at the right table. Jon read it and laughed once. A single bark that surprised his own ears and the men outside his door. He put the letter in the chest where he kept the pieces of paper that had carved his days, and that night he slept without dreams. In the end, if there is an end in such matters, Karhold stood. Winterfell stood, one way or another. The Night's Watch stood, which is not to say that it did not sway. Jon Snow stood. He did not stand because he was the tallest or the strongest or even the most stubborn. He stood because the world had needed someone to put a hand on a tree and say a word and then keep saying it until it meant something again. He stood because when a woman asked him to be a wall, he had not answered no. On a day in high summer that was not, Alice Karstark came to the wall with Sigorn and 3 children, who looked like all the houses in their faces and none of them exactly. She stood with Jon in the yard and looked up at the ice and said, "If the gods made this, I forgive them for a lot. They made worse," Jon said, and she laughed. "Do you regret binding me?" she asked, after a while, eyes still on the blue and white. "No," Jon said. "I regret not knowing the words sooner." She turned to him. "There were no words for this before," she said. "You made them. I only said what we already knew." he answered. That is all words are, she said. And then she bent to let a child run hands through the dirty snow at the wall's foot and squeal at the cold. Make sure your men have enough to eat, she added over her shoulder, brusque again, plain as any northern warning. Men who eat are more honest. Men who starve become poets and traitors. Is there a difference? Jon asked. Ask a man who has been cold, she said, and the child shrieked happily as cold burned his fingers, and the wall breathed its old slow breath, and Ghost stood with his nose high and scented something older than even names. Jon put his hand to the ice. It was like putting a hand to bone. It didn't need him. It accepted him. That was enough. He thought then of a day when he had stood instead in a godswood, and the bark had been rough under his palm, and the blood of the tree had looked like tears, and he had said a word that had weighed nothing and everything, and afterward it had weighed a house. Winter was not over. It would not be for years. The dead still stirred in dark places men had forgotten to fear. Kings would come and go, as they always have, and their names would shine and dim like torches seen far off in snowfall. But the North had tied one end of itself to something that would not move in a storm. And the man who had given it that knot went on mending ropes and speaking aloud the things that must be said. And when he slept, he dreamed not of crowns or walls or knives, but of a black ribbon untying, and then tying itself again, exactly where it needed to be.